In the quiet town of Ashcroft, a child's innocent trip to the park takes a dark and unexpected turn, plunging the community into a nightmare of fear and suspicion. As Detective Harper races against time to uncover the truth, unsettling discoveries begin to surface, leading to a web of secrets, far more chilling than anyone imagined. How far would you go to protect the ones you love when darkness lurks in the most familiar places? The call came at 8:15 a.m., a scratchy voice on the other end of my desk phone. The voice belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, a widow in her late 60s who often babysat children in the small, tightly knit community of Ashcroft. Her words, tumbling in waves of panic, formed a chilling picture. Emily never came home last night. Emily Carter, 9 years old, had been playing at the neighborhood park, a short walk from her home. She told Mrs. Walsh she'd be back by sundown, but the night stretched long and silent. By morning, there was no sign of her. I scribbled the details, dread pooling in my gut. Cases like this never ended well. Ashcroft was the kind of town where you'd expect kids to ride their bikes through tree-lined streets, and stop to chat with neighbors leaning on their fences. But lately, there had been whispers, strange men seen loitering near the school, a car idling too long at the playground. Little things, easily dismissed. Now, they weren't so easy to ignore. I arrived at the park just after 9. The air was damp, the grass slick with dew. A frayed swing hung limply in the breeze, and the sandbox was littered with footprints from children's games played the day before. A forgotten pink hair clip glinted near the slide. I pocketed it for evidence, a small chill crawling up my spine. The park's maintenance worker, Rick, approached me with a cigarette clamped between his lips. "She's not here," he said, almost apologetically. "Checked first thing." His eyes darted toward the trees, where dense underbrush could easily conceal anything, or anyone. I combed through the scene, my eyes tracing each path and alley that led away from the park. One trail led deeper into the woods, toward a creek children often played near. Another curved back into the neighborhood. By the swing set, a faded flyer clung to the bulletin board, flapping weakly. "Neighborhood Watch Meeting." It read, dated 2 weeks prior. The irony was bitter. The longer I stood there, the louder the silence seemed to grow. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. My instincts prickled, a sensation I hadn't felt since my days on the city force, tracking a child predator whose shadow haunted my dreams for years after we caught him. I radioed dispatch to begin organizing a search party. Emily wasn't just lost. I was sure of it. It was only the first day of the investigation, but the shadows that clung to the park seemed to whisper what no one dared to say aloud. Emily Carter wasn't coming home the way she'd left. By midday, the park had become a hive of activity. Volunteers gathered in tight clusters, their voices low and anxious. Most were parents, their faces etched with fear as they glanced at their own children, who clung close and silent. Sheriff Holman stood by his cruiser, issuing orders to the newly formed search teams. I leaned against my unmarked sedan, watching them fan out into the woods. "Detective Harper?" A young officer jogged over, his notebook in hand. "We've started canvassing the neighborhood. A couple of residents mentioned a white van parked near the park around 5 yesterday. The driver was a man, mid-40s, wearing a baseball cap. No plate number yet." White vans. The ultimate boogeyman of a detective's nightmares. I nodded grimly. "Get a full description." Someone had to see more. "And check the traffic cams leading out of town." The woods were next. I joined a team equipped with dogs, their handlers struggling to keep them steady as the animals pulled at their leashes. The path leading to the creek was narrow, lined with dense bushes that snagged at my coat. The farther we went, the quieter it became, save for the crunch of boots on dirt and the occasional bark of a restless dog. At the creek, we stopped. A volunteer waded into the shallow water, his flashlight scanning the pebbled bottom. Nothing. I caught sight of something snagged on a branch near the bank and stepped closer. It was a child's sock, small, pink, and damp. It didn't match the hair clip from the park, but my stomach turned all the same. The discovery ramped up the urgency. Within the hour, more officers arrived to scour the area. The dogs were unleashed, their noses working furiously as they darted through the underbrush. I pressed onward, following a faint trail that wound deeper into the woods. The air grew colder, the trees blocking out what little sunlight remained. Then we found it. A clearing, littered with trash, beer cans, fast food wrappers, cigarette butts. The remnants of an old campfire sat at its center, surrounded by flattened grass that looked recently disturbed. A rusted folding chair leaned against a tree, its seat stained with something dark. Blood? Or just the remnants of a careless spill? I crouched beside the chair, scanning the ground. A faint drag mark led from the campfire toward the edge of the clearing, disappearing into the brush. My gut clenched. Something had been here, someone. And they hadn't wanted to be found. "Detective!" A voice called from the edge of the woods. I turned, hurrying back toward the sound. A dog handler stood near the creek, his face pale. "The dog's caught a scent. It's strong." I followed him, my heart pounding as we pushed through the underbrush. The dogs barked wildly, circling an area near a fallen tree. The ground was disturbed, loose dirt packed hastily over something buried. The team fell silent, a collective breath held as a shovel was passed forward. I crouched beside the makeshift grave, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The first scoop of dirt confirmed it. A child's shoe, pale pink with sparkles, protruded from the soil. I took a step back, my chest tightening. Emily's mother would need answers. And the answers we'd found here would destroy her world. The shoe protruding from the soil was impossibly small. It was the kind you see in shop windows, marketed to parents as practical but cute. I stared at it for a moment too long before signaling for the forensics team to move in. My breath felt heavy in my chest as they began digging, carefully removing layer after layer of dirt. A pale arm emerged first, tiny, motionless, and streaked with soil. The forensics techs froze, their gloves hovering in midair, as if even the act of touching her might make it all too real. One of them muttered something under his breath, a prayer or maybe a curse, before continuing. Finally, her face appeared. Emily. Her features were still recognizable despite the bruising that bloomed across her cheeks and jaw. Her lips were parted, as if she'd been about to speak. Her eyes were closed, and for a moment, I could imagine she was simply asleep. But then the bruises told their story, as did the ligature marks encircling her small neck. Someone had taken her innocence, her life, and then discarded her here, in the dirt like garbage. The anger that boiled in my gut was only held back by the weight of procedure. We couldn't make a mistake now. Not when she deserved justice. "Detective!" A voice broke my thoughts. It was one of the forensics officers. "There's something else here." He pulled a small, folded piece of paper from beneath Emily's body, sealed it in an evidence bag, and handed it to me. I unfolded the bag carefully, my hands steady despite the rage bubbling under my skin. The note was short, handwritten in black ink. "She didn't listen. Will the next one?" The words made my blood run cold. This wasn't an impulsive act or a crime of passion. It was calculated, a warning, a taunt. Whoever had done this wasn't finished. Behind me, I heard murmurs as officers radioed in the discovery. The woods were suddenly alive with movement, but all I could hear was the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze and the note's chilling implication: someone else's child could be next. The team worked to secure the area while I stepped back, struggling to compose myself. Emily's body was lifted carefully into a body bag, her small shoe still clinging to her foot. The sight sent a lump to my throat. I hadn't been able to save her. But I could catch whoever had done this. Back at the edge of the woods, the crowd of volunteers waited, their faces stricken as they saw the medical examiner's team carry the stretcher toward the van. I could hear whispers ripple through the crowd. "They found her. She's gone." And then there was the scream, a piercing, heart-wrenching sound that tore through the quiet like a blade. Emily's mother had arrived. Her cries followed me all the way to my car. They stayed with me as I radioed dispatch for backup, as I called for an emergency town meeting, and as I started the long drive back to the station. Those cries didn't fade. They didn't soften. And they wouldn't, not until I put the monster who had done this behind bars. Back at the station, I spread the photographs across my desk. The shoe, the note, the bruising around Emily's neck, it all painted a picture I'd seen before, though never this clearly. Crimes like this didn't spring up out of nowhere. Monsters didn't evolve overnight. The crime lab called within hours, confirming what I'd suspected. Emily's death matched the hallmarks of another case, one that had gone unsolved. 2 years ago, in a town 30 miles west of Ashcroft, another child had vanished from a playground. She'd been found 3 days later in a wooded area, strangled and bruised. The only difference? No note had been left behind. I stared at the evidence board, its stark lines connecting Emily's face to other pieces of the puzzle. A map of Ashcroft sat in the center, marked with the locations of the park and the creek. Around it, I tacked up photos from the older case. The images blurred together, 2 innocent faces now joined by a dark thread. The clock ticked on the wall, loud and insistent, as if it were mocking my inability to catch the killer before he struck again. I sank deeper into my chair, replaying every decision I'd made in the past 24 hours. What had I missed? Where could I have been faster, smarter? I heard the knock before I saw him. Sheriff Holman stepped in, his face a mask of exhaustion. "Got something," he said, dropping a file onto my desk. "Surveillance footage from a gas station near the edge of town. Yesterday, around 6 p.m., a white van parked near Pump 3. Driver matched the description, baseball cap, mid-40s. He bought cigarettes and left." I flipped through the grainy photos. They showed the van, its front grille dented and a strip of rust along the passenger door. The man was blurry but visible enough to make out a round face and a scruffy beard. He wasn't looking at the camera, deliberate or just lucky, I couldn't tell. "There's no plate," Holman added, his voice tight. "Either it was covered, or it's a fake." I nodded, swallowing my frustration. "Did the clerk say anything about him?" "Paid in cash. Didn't say a word. Just grabbed his smokes and left." It wasn't much, but it was something. The van was the closest thing we had to a lead, and I wasn't letting it slip away. I sent officers to neighboring towns, scouring highways and backroads. A description of the vehicle went out to every precinct within a 100-mile radius. Hours passed. Darkness fell. My desk lamp burned late into the night as I combed through reports, my mind racing. Was he still here? Watching us? Waiting for the heat to die down before he struck again? I thought of the note. "Will the next one?" The words gnawed at me, a sinister promise that more pain was coming. Somewhere out there, a man was sitting in his van or walking the streets, looking for his next victim. And I was chasing his shadow. The morning came with no new sightings of the van. The frustration in the station was palpable, officers snapping at each other, radios crackling with leads that fizzled out as quickly as they came. I spent the early hours poring over the file from the older case, searching for anything we might have missed. There was no note then, no taunt. Either he had escalated, or he was growing careless. But there was a pattern. Both girls had been taken in broad daylight, within walking distance of their homes. Both scenes were near wooded areas, places that offered cover but were easy to reach by car. And in both cases, there had been whispers beforehand, strangers lurking, vehicles idling too long. Emily's case wasn't an anomaly. It was the continuation of a plan. Sheriff Holman called me into his office just after noon. He looked more tired than I felt, which was saying something. "Harper," he said, motioning for me to close the door. "We've got a profiler coming in from the state. Someone who can help make sense of this guy." I nodded, though I wasn't entirely convinced. Profiles were useful, but they weren't magic. They wouldn't tell us the van's plate number or the killer's address. Still, we needed all the help we could get. While I waited, I turned my focus to the park. Emily's abduction had to have been quick, snatched when no one was looking. I pulled the visitor log from the rec center across the street. The center ran afternoon programs for kids, and their log might hold a clue. Sure enough, several names jumped out: parents, volunteers, regulars who'd been at the park or nearby that day. One name caught my eye: Jacob Harlow, a 43-year-old janitor who'd been working part-time at the rec center for the past year. He'd signed in that afternoon, but hadn't clocked out until 2 hours after the park was closed. A quick search pulled up his file. Nothing alarming, a DUI 10 years ago, no violent offenses. Still, he drove an old Chevy van, white with a dented front grille. By 2 p.m., I was standing on the stoop of Harlow's small bungalow. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where curtains twitched at the sight of an unfamiliar face. My knock echoed in the still air, and I waited, my hand resting on the holster at my side. Harlow answered on the second knock. He was shorter than I'd expected, stocky with a shaved head and a faintly nervous demeanor. "Detective Harper," I introduced myself, flashing my badge. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" He hesitated, his eyes darting to the patrol car parked down the street. "What's this about?" "Just routine," I lied. "We're following up on an incident at the park." He nodded and let me in. The living room was cluttered but clean, the faint smell of cigarettes lingering in the air. A small TV flickered in the corner, playing an old sitcom. On the wall above it was a framed picture of Harlow with 2 boys, his nephews, according to the rec center log. I kept my questions light at first: how long he'd worked at the center, whether he'd seen anything unusual that day. He answered easily, but his hands fidgeted constantly, his eyes never quite meeting mine. When I asked about his van, his body stiffened. "It's in the shop," he said too quickly. "Transmission shot." My gut told me he was lying, but gut feelings weren't enough. I thanked him for his time and left, making a mental note to have his van checked. Back at the station, I pulled the CCTV footage from the gas station. The image was blurry, but the van's rusted passenger door matched the description of Harlow's. This wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a lead, and it was getting warmer. Jacob Harlow's name buzzed through the station within the hour. Officers were sent to track down his van, and I placed a call to the rec center for more information about his work history. The pieces weren't falling into place fast enough, though. Every second we wasted felt like an open invitation for him to strike again. By mid-afternoon, we found the van. It was parked behind an auto repair shop on the edge of town, as Harlow had claimed. The shop owner confirmed it had been there for 2 days. The timing left me cold. It arrived only after Emily had gone missing. A search of the vehicle yielded little: a few tools, fast food wrappers, and an air freshener dangling from the rearview mirror. No evidence of Emily, but the smell of bleach was unmistakable. Back at the station, I called in the profiler, a woman named Dr. Evelyn Kane, who'd arrived that morning. She was seated in Holman's office, her thin frame stiff in the oversized chair. Her demeanor was clinical, almost cold, as she reviewed the case notes. "This is someone who thrives on control," she said after a long silence. "He takes his victims in familiar areas, places where he knows the rhythms of the environment. The parks, the woods, they're not random. He's comfortable there." "And the note?" I asked, thinking of the chilling words tucked beneath Emily's body. Dr. Kane nodded. "The note suggests escalation. He wants attention, maybe even recognition. He's daring you to catch him." Her words echoed in my head as I left the office. I hated the idea of playing into the killer's hands, but she was right. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. He wanted an audience. I spent the evening combing through Harlow's records, looking for anything I might have missed. The gaps in his employment history were suspicious, and a closer look revealed he'd moved between towns frequently, staying just long enough to avoid scrutiny. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to bring him in for questioning. We picked Harlow up the next morning. He was calmer than I'd expected, his hands resting casually on his knees as he sat across from me in the interrogation room. The walls seemed to close in around us as I started with the basics: where he'd been, what he'd seen, who could vouch for him. He answered everything smoothly, his voice steady. Then I brought up the van. Harlow's composure cracked. His fidgeting returned, his eyes darting to the mirrored wall behind me. I told you it's in the shop, he said, his tone defensive. We know that, I replied, keeping my voice even. We also know it was brought in after Emily went missing. What I don't know, Jacob, is why your van matches the description of the ones seen near the park. He didn't answer, but the tension in his jaw gave him away. I leaned in closer. We found bleach in your van. Care to explain why? That's not illegal, he snapped, his face flushing. I keep it clean. It's more than clean, Jacob. It's spotless. Too spotless. He glared at me, but I could see the cracks widening. Still, without hard evidence, I had nothing to hold him on. When he demanded a lawyer, the interrogation was over. I watched him leave the station with his public defender, his gait slow and deliberate, like a man daring me to make my next move. In the pit of my stomach, I knew he was the one. But until I could prove it, he was free to walk away. Letting Harlow walk out of the station was like handing a loaded gun to a madman and waiting for him to pull the trigger. Every instinct screamed to bring him back, to shake the truth out of him, but instincts weren't admissible in court. I needed something concrete. Hours turned into a blur of phone calls, reports, and dead ends. The weight of failure pressed down with every tick of the clock. Then, just after midnight, a patrol officer called in from the outskirts of town. Detective Harper? You're gonna want to see this. The officer, Torres, met me near an abandoned lot on the western edge of Ashcroft. The land had once been part of a construction project that never materialized, leaving skeletal frames of half-built homes and rusting equipment scattered like monuments to failure. Torres guided me toward a shallow ditch behind a cluster of steel beams. This is where the dogs led us, he said grimly, his flashlight illuminating the area. The beam landed on a pile of debris, branches, leaves, and trash packed loosely together. He pointed to a corner where something unnatural glinted in the light. It was a child's bracelet, tangled in the brush. A small charm dangled from the chain, a unicorn with chipped pink enamel. I knew it immediately from the photo Emily's mother had provided. She'd worn it everywhere. Torres called for backup as I stepped closer, the cold air heavy in my lungs. The ground beneath the pile was disturbed, the dirt uneven and loose. The search team arrived quickly, shovels in hand. It didn't take long before they unearthed what was beneath. A second grave. It wasn't Emily. This child had been here longer, her body showing signs of decay that Emily's hadn't. Forensics would confirm her identity, but I already knew. This was Allison Green, the 9-year-old taken 2 years ago from the neighboring town. She'd been left here, forgotten, until Emily's death forced her killer's hand. I scanned the area as the team worked, trying to piece together the logic of the scene. The location was deliberate, far enough from prying eyes, but close enough to revisit. Harlow knew this place. The bracelet was his mistake, a sliver of carelessness that cracked his carefully constructed control. At the station, I dove into old property records and employment logs, searching for connections between Harlow and the abandoned lot. It didn't take long. 10 years ago, during a brief stint as a contractor's assistant, he'd worked on this site. He would have known every corner of it, every hiding place. By morning, I had enough to secure a search warrant for Harlow's home. The team moved in quickly, tearing through the bungalow while I stood outside, my fists clenched as the minutes dragged on. Then, a shout came from one of the officers inside. They'd found a hidden compartment in his closet. Inside were mementos, photos of children taken from a distance, small trinkets, and most damning of all, another note written in the same scrawling hand as the one left with Emily. It read, "2 down. Who will stop me?" This time I would. By noon, Jacob Harlow was back in custody, and this time, he wasn't leaving. The warrant had turned up more than enough to tie him to both murders. The notes, the photos, the bracelet, it was all there, each piece of evidence another nail in the coffin of his freedom. I watched from the observation room as he sat in the interrogation chair, his shoulders hunched, his hands resting limply on the table. The cocky indifference he displayed earlier was gone. In its place was something quieter, something darker, a simmering anger he didn't bother to hide anymore. Sheriff Holman sat across from him, his tone calm but firm. "We've got you, Jacob. The bracelet, the photos, the notes. You don't walk away from this." Harlow smirked, the expression chilling in its emptiness. "You think I care about walking away? You don't understand, Sheriff. None of you do." I leaned closer to the glass, every muscle in my body taut as I waited for him to slip, to give us something. Anything. But he only leaned back, his eyes half-lidded, his voice dropping into a mocking tone. "You think this ends with me, don't you? Like I'm the only one." Holman pressed on. "What does that mean, Jacob? Who else is involved?" Silence. Harlow's lips curled into a faint smile, but he said nothing more. The room felt suffocating as the seconds stretched into minutes. Finally, Holman stood, signaling the end of the session. "You'll have plenty of time to think about what you've done," he said, his voice low. But as he reached for the door, Harlow spoke again, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "You'll never stop it. There's always another one." His words followed us out of the room, their meaning vague but haunting. Was he bluffing? Taunting us? Or was there something bigger at play, something we hadn't yet uncovered? The forensics team continued combing through Harlow's belongings as we prepared to charge him with Emily's murder and Allison Green's. But the chilling note he'd left behind, "Two down. Who will stop me?" lingered in my mind. Was he referring to the two girls we'd already found, or was there another victim we hadn't discovered yet? I pored over the files again, retracing Harlow's movements over the past decade. Each job, each relocation, each gap in his employment history was a potential clue. The abandoned lot where Allison was buried wasn't the only place he'd worked. There were others: construction sites, warehouses, even a short stint as a landscaper for a wealthy estate outside of Ashcroft. I marked each location on a map, watching as the lines began to form a pattern. They radiated outward like a web, each strand leading to a small, unassuming town. It was too deliberate to be coincidence. Harlow hadn't just been drifting, he'd been hunting. I knew there was more to uncover, more pain buried beneath the surface of this case. And as much as I wanted to take solace in the fact that Harlow was behind bars, I couldn't shake the feeling that his words weren't a bluff. "There's always another one." Harlow's cryptic parting words gnawed at me, burrowing deep into my thoughts as I worked late into the night. The evidence had painted a horrifyingly clear picture of his crimes, but there was something deeper in his taunts, something deliberate. It was as if he wanted us to keep digging. And so I did. The map of Harlow's movements sat on my desk, each pin marking a place he'd lived or worked. I spread out the police reports from surrounding towns, cross-referencing them with his timeline. Patterns began to emerge. Small towns, transient jobs, and always the same dark undertone: children disappearing, sometimes found, sometimes not. In a town 40 miles south, a boy had gone missing 8 years ago, his body found weeks later in a shallow grave behind an abandoned motel. In another, 50 miles west, twin sisters had vanished while walking home from school. Their remains were never recovered. The more I looked, the more victims I uncovered, each one a cold case tied by a fragile thread to Harlow's proximity. It was no longer a question of whether Harlow had more victims, it was how many. The next morning, I presented my findings to Sheriff Holman. His face hardened as I laid out the timeline, the map, and the chilling implications. "If we can tie him to even half of these cases," I said, "we're looking at one of the most prolific predators this state has ever seen." Holman nodded grimly. "What's our next move?" "We need to revisit every site he's ever worked. If he left bodies behind, we'll find them." The task force was mobilized within hours. Officers spread out across the state, armed with cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and a list of locations. I joined the team heading to the estate where Harlow had worked as a landscaper. The property was sprawling, its manicured gardens bordered by dense woods. It was the kind of place where secrets could be buried deep, hidden in plain sight. The dogs hit on something almost immediately: a patch of disturbed soil near the tree line. As the team began digging, I stood back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The first shovelful of dirt revealed a scrap of fabric, faded and torn. Then, the unmistakable curve of a small rib cage. The search stretched into the evening. By the time we left, the medical examiner had removed the remains of 3 children from the property. Each discovery felt like a fresh blow, a reminder of how long Harlow's reign of terror had gone unchecked. Back at the station, the atmosphere was grim. News of the findings spread quickly, and the weight of what we were uncovering settled over everyone like a heavy fog. Forensic analysis would confirm the identities of the remains, but I already knew they would match the cold cases on my map. The task force continued to work through the night, combing through the other locations tied to Harlow's past. The body count rose steadily, each new discovery adding to the grim legacy of his crimes. He hadn't been bluffing. This wasn't just a murderer, it was a legacy of horror. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a chilling thought lingered: what if he wasn't working alone? By the time dawn broke, the scope of Harlow's crimes had become undeniable. From the farthest corners of the state, reports streamed in: more remains uncovered, more cold cases linked to his name. In total, 10 confirmed victims and counting. Each one a child, each one robbed of their future. But the most chilling discovery wasn't the body count. It was the notebook. Found in a rusted lockbox buried beneath Harlow's bungalow, the notebook contained page after page of scrawled handwriting, names, dates, and locations spanning over a decade. It was a meticulous log of his victims, a journal of his crimes. But interspersed between the entries were notes written in a different hand. The second handwriting was sharper, more angular, and distinctly different from Harlow's unsteady scrawl. The notes were brief, almost like instructions. Watch the park. Check the schoolyard at dusk. Be quick. Harlow hadn't been working alone. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. The idea that there was someone else out there, someone just as dangerous, someone who might still be operating, changed everything. Harlow refused to talk, sitting silently in his cell, his lips curled into that infuriating smirk. He'd won his game, or so he thought. But the notebook was his undoing. One of the names listed didn't match any of the victims we'd identified. Megan Whitmore. She wasn't in our files, and a quick search revealed why: she wasn't dead. Megan was a survivor. A rush of hope surged through me as I tracked her down. Now 19, she lived in a quiet suburb 3 towns over. When I knocked on her door, she hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. But when I mentioned Harlow's name, her face crumpled. Inside, Megan told her story. She'd been 10 when Harlow tried to abduct her from the park near her home. She didn't remember much, just the white van, the smell of cigarettes, and the man with the baseball cap. But what she did remember was chilling. He wasn't alone, she said, her voice shaking. There was another man. He stayed in the van. I saw his face in the mirror. I pressed her for details, but the memory was hazy. Still, it was enough. Harlow hadn't just been enabled, he'd been partnered. Somewhere out there, his accomplice was still walking free. In the days that followed, we poured everything into tracking down the second man. Harlow's notebook provided clues, names of accomplices, places where they'd met, but most of the leads were dead ends. Whoever this man was, he'd covered his tracks well. Then a break. A fingerprint found on one of the notes in the notebook led us to Arthur Crow, a drifter with a history of petty crime. Crow had worked with Harlow at a warehouse years ago, and his last known address put him only 15 miles from Ashcroft. The pieces clicked into place, and we moved quickly. When we found Crow, he didn't run. He didn't fight. He just sat on the edge of his sagging porch, staring at the ground as if he'd been waiting for this moment. I didn't touch them, he said as we cuffed him. It was all Harlow. I just helped. Helped. The word tasted bitter. For years, he'd driven the van, scouted locations, and stayed silent while children were taken and killed. He was just as guilty as Harlow, if not more. The arrest of Harlow's accomplice brought some measure of closure, but the scars left behind by their crimes ran deep. Families shattered, innocents stolen, These wounds wouldn't heal easily. Emily Carter, Allison Green, and all the others would never come home, their lives reduced to cold cases solved too late. I visited Emily's mother a week after Harlow's sentencing. She sat on her porch, a blanket draped over her lap despite the warm weather. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears, but she managed a small smile. "Thank you," she whispered. "For finding her. For not giving up." I nodded, though the words felt hollow. Nothing I'd done could bring Emily back. But at least her killer would never hurt another child. That had to count for something. As I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't uncovered the full truth. Harlow and Crow were monsters, but monsters don't act alone without reason. Somewhere out there, in some dark corner, another shadow might be waiting to rise. For now, though, Ashcroft could sleep a little easier. The ghosts of the past had been unearthed, and their cries for justice had finally been answered.